The widow had not planned to whisper. Her voice had simply given up on being loud after too many nights of silence. The wind rolled across the open plain like a slow breath, lifting dust and dry grass around her boots as she stood at the edge of the road with everything she owned packed into 2 worn bags. Her coat was too thin for the evening chill, her hands rough from work that never seemed to last, and her eyes held the kind of tired that came from hoping too long. When the horse slowed beside her, she didn't even look up at first. She thought it was just another passerby who would ride on, the way everyone always did. But then a calm voice, deep and steady, broke the quiet. "Are you lost, ma'am?" She turned, startled, and met the gaze of a man who looked like he belonged to the land itself. He sat tall in the saddle, broad shoulders wrapped in a dust-colored coat, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that had seen more than they let on. There was no hurry in him, no suspicion either, just a kind of patient attention that made her throat tighten. She hesitated, then nodded, her voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know where I'm going anymore." The cowboy studied her for a long moment, taking in the bags, the worn boots, the way she stood as if ready to run, even while standing still. Then he tipped his hat slightly and said words that would change her life forever. "Then follow me home." She didn't know he was a millionaire. She didn't know his name carried weight across 3 counties, that men in suits waited days to speak with him, or that the land stretching beyond the hills belonged to him. All she knew was that something in his voice felt solid, like a fence post driven deep into the ground. Against every instinct to refuse kindness, because kindness had a way of disappearing, she nodded. They walked first, her pace slow from days on the road, his horse moving beside her so she wouldn't feel rushed. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. She told him her name was Clara. She didn't say widow out loud, but it hovered between them anyway. He introduced himself simply as James. No last name, no titles. As they moved, he asked no probing questions. He didn't ask why she was alone or where she'd come from. He asked instead if she'd eaten. When she shook her head, embarrassed, he reached into his saddlebag and handed her a wrapped piece of bread and jerky. She took it like it might vanish if she moved too fast. They reached the ranch just as the first stars came out. Clara stopped short, staring at the wide gates, the long fence line, the lights glowing warmly from the main house and the bunkhouse beyond. This wasn't a shack. This wasn't even a small farm. It was something else entirely, something that didn't fit the idea of home she'd been carrying in her mind. "I can't stay here," she said quickly, fear creeping back in. "I don't have money." James dismounted and met her eye to eye. Didn't ask for any. He led her to the house, where a housekeeper named Mrs. Alden looked up in surprise, but said nothing when James asked her to prepare a room and a hot meal. Clara sat at the table, hands folded tightly in her lap, as steam rose from a bowl of soup placed in front of her. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful brought tears to her eyes. That night, in a clean bed with fresh sheets, Clara slept deeper than she had in years. In the days that followed, she learned the rhythm of the ranch. She helped where she could, folding laundry, tending the garden, mending clothes, always careful not to overstep. James never stopped her, never corrected her, only thanked her as if she were doing him a favor. He left early each morning and returned late, dust on his boots, quiet but never cold. People came to the ranch often, men who spoke respectfully, sometimes nervously. Clara overheard snippets of conversation about land deals, cattle contracts, banks. Slowly, the truth settled in. James wasn't just a cowboy. He was the cowboy, the man who owned more land than anyone else in the territory. The millionaire people whispered about in town. The knowledge made her uneasy. She felt suddenly small, like she'd wandered somewhere she didn't belong. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, Clara finally spoke. "I didn't know who you were." James smiled faintly. "I didn't ask you to. I can't stay forever," she said. "People will talk." "They always do," he replied. "Let them." Her past, however, refused to stay quiet. One afternoon, a man arrived at the gate, sharp-eyed, dressed too well for the dust. Clara recognized him instantly. Her stomach dropped. It was her brother-in-law, Henry, the man who had taken everything after her husband died. The man who'd told her she was a burden, who'd forced her out with nothing but her clothes and a small bag. Henry demanded to see James. Clara stood frozen as voices rose. She heard Henry's sharp laugh. You don't know who she is, do you? She's trouble. Always has been. James stepped forward, his presence alone enough to still the air. I know enough. Henry scoffed. She has no claim to anything. No money. No family worth mentioning. James's voice stayed calm. She has a place here. Henry's eyes flicked to Clara, narrowing. You think you can protect her? James met his stare. I already am. Henry left, spitting dust and threats, but Clara trembled long after he was gone. That night, she confessed everything. How her husband had died suddenly. How the will had disappeared. How she'd been pushed out, accused of lying, left to survive however she could. James listened without interruption. When she finished, he leaned back, eyes thoughtful. We'll sort it out. She shook her head. You don't owe me that. He looked at her then, really looked. I owe it to myself to do what's right. Over the next weeks, lawyers came and went. Documents surfaced. Witnesses were found. The truth emerged slowly but surely. Clara's husband had left her more than Henry claimed. Land, money, rights Henry had stolen. The day the ruling came down, Clara felt numb. She was entitled to more than she'd ever imagined. Enough to start over. Enough to leave. She packed quietly, not wanting to make a scene. James found her at the door, bags in hand. Running off again? He asked gently. I don't want to be a burden, she said, tears finally spilling. I can stand on my own now. He stepped closer. Clara, you stopped being a burden the moment you walked through that gate. She hesitated. Then what am I? He took off his hat, a rare sign of vulnerability. You're home, if you want to be. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. She realized then that somewhere between shared meals and quiet evenings, something else had grown. Respect. Trust. Something warmer. She stayed. The town talked, of course, about the millionaire cowboy and the widow he'd taken in. Some said she'd planned it. Others said she was lucky. None of them knew the truth, that two lost people had found steady ground in each other. Months later, as spring rolled across the land in green waves, James took Clara riding at dawn. They stopped on a hill overlooking the ranch, the sun just cresting the horizon. I spent my life building fences, James said quietly. Keeping things in, keeping things out. Didn't realize how lonely it was. Clara smiled softly. I spent mine knocking on doors that never opened. He reached for her hand, rough fingers warm around hers. This one's open. She squeezed back, heart full. The widow who once whispered she was lost stood taller now, her voice strong as the land beneath her feet. And the millionaire cowboy who had everything finally understood that home wasn't measured in acres or wealth, but in the courage to say, follow me, and mean it. They married quietly that summer, no grand ceremony, just close friends, open skies, and vows spoken without fear. Together, they built something stronger than either had known before, a life rooted in kindness, resilience, and the simple truth that sometimes the right road begins when someone stops and asks if you're lost. And this time, when Clara followed him home, she knew she was exactly where she belonged.